Fucking Instagram. All right, we're live. That was faster than normal. All right, Instagram. All right, YouTube. All right, TikTok. We are live talking about the suspension on sixth generation 4Runners. That's 2025 plus. We just got out of the desert yesterday from testing the Radflos 500R Sport 2.0 coilovers and shocks. And they were probably the best 2.0s I have tested. Obviously, they're a 2-inch body shock. Don't expect them to let you fly through the air, do anything crazy, but they were just the most solid setup. They did everything really well. Handling's great. They're comfortable. They're supportive. And they just felt great everywhere. Probably one of the first set of shocks I tested in a long time that weren't really speed dependent in a lot of situations. There's a lot of shocks where you have to drive faster off road to get them to smooth out, to soften up a little bit, or drive slower to keep from bouncing around all the time. And all the way up until their limit, they were just as happy as they were at lower speeds. Obviously, the limit's pretty low, but they were really good. And, actually, I say the limit's low because they're 2.0s, but they seem to do a little bit more than a lot of the other 2.0s we've tested. So they're a really solid option. And I would recommend them for, if you're looking for an entry level starter kit for just about anybody, unless, you're 100% looking to go like a million miles an hour. But even so, I think we hit 38 through our whoop section, which is really good. That's I want to say 8 to 15 miles an hour faster than we've hit any with any 2-inch body shock. Yeah, Radflow. Yeah, you saw it. They did better than any other 2.0 we've had in that same whoop section. We're talking 8 to maybe 15, depending on the shocks, miles an hour faster than everything else we've had there. All the other 2-inch body shocks. Obviously, we've gotten faster in 2.5s, but they did extraordinarily well. There's nowhere where we had a complaint. You guys will see it in the review in the coming weeks. It's almost boring how good they are. They just kind of do the thing, and then there's no muss, there's no fuss. There's not much to talk about. They just do what they're supposed to do. And that sounds boring. It doesn't sound like a huge compliment, but when it comes to suspension, that is a huge compliment. It just working, it's not something you have to think about, is really big. Hello, my friend. What do you recommend for Patrol Y62 with level 5 armor? Depends on your goals. For these specific vehicle recommendations, guys, go on shocksurplus.com, ask the team directly. As much as I would like to give you direction here, we really take our shock recommendations seriously, and we want to know all the information. I don't want to take away from anybody's questions, but the team has you covered. As far as options, both Dobinson, King, and Old Man Ingu all have options specifically spec'd for armored vehicles. So it kind of depends on what your goals, your budgets, what you're looking to do. What shocks are we talking about? So the shocks I was just talking about in the beginning were the new Radflos 500R Sport 2.0 coilovers. They're really good. They're really, really, really good. I haven't felt the 2.0 on anything work that well. And, I say that caveat because I know their 2.5s are way better. But the 2.0s still works great. Let me see here. CDEV, the Icon CDEVs are great. If you aren't able to run an SDI specific kit, so Tacoma 4Runner Raptor SDI kit, the CDEVs are probably going to be available for your vehicle and work great. They use a lot of the same technology. I think electronically controlled shocks are the future. And if you're spending that money, and maybe one, in-cab adjustment's sick. They got the app. It's sick. Two, there's a lot of times where a position sensitive shock, other options at that price point are usually position sensitive, may not work well, particularly if you're going to see a lot of ride height change from load, or if handling is a real priority. That is actually a condition where electronically controlled stuff actually does better. So Icon CDEVs are in the top list of shocks that we usually recommend for a lot of people, or the top highest performing, one of the best things you can run. It's just, might be situationally more beneficial to, maybe you might benefit from a position sensitive shock. That's not to say that the, electronically controlled stuff isn't the future and isn't great. Does tire size matter as much for high speed pre-running? Debating from going from a 31 to a 33 on a second gen Tacoma. In your case, so going from small to slightly less small tires, like a 31 to a 33, is going to be largely all benefits. Almost any suspension setup, except for like super basic stuff in stock, is going to be able to handle that unsprung mass, no problem. What those bigger tires are going to do is make those holes a lot smaller. And 31s are small. Every whoop is, real big when you're 31 and when it swallows your whole 31-inch tire. If you have a 33, there's a greater chance of you skimming over the top, which is going to help everywhere. Also, having more sidewall will also help small bump compliance and almost everything like that. Protect your rims. It is so going up to a 33 is a great idea. I wouldn't be scared to go to a 35 if you had at least a 2.5-inch body shock in the front. You're gonna cut. You're gonna have to cut. I should say if you have a Tacoma, you're gonna have to cut for 35s. But Leon on YouTube asked, "What's some personal pros and cons of the 6th gen 4Runner versus previous 5th gen mostly?" So all pros mostly is one, they make it up a hill. The horsepower numbers, even without the hybrid option, without iForce Max, don't look like it's a big difference, but drivability is completely different. Everybody has like this love for the 4-liter V6, and it is very reliable, but it is just generally god awful in every other like standpoint. It doesn't make power, isn't efficient, and the power band is really narrow, or not super narrow. It's pretty narrow for a V6, or it's pretty wide for a V6, narrow all things considered. The new turbo 4 cylinders are a game changer there. They can also fit a lot larger tire. I mean, we're talking about a lot larger with a lot less trimming. You can just put a 33-inch tire on there and not have to worry about anything when you're chopping up a 5th gen, to go much bigger than a 33. And a lot of times for 33s, you need to cut some stuff. Rear end is better. I believe a lot of them are now becoming, at least on the Tier D off-road, now have like the 9.5-inch rear axle, which is super stout. Steering is better. The rack is definitely stronger. I do think they might have lost some rear seat space compared to the old 4Runners, but that's kind of hard to tell, and the interior feels nice. I think it's all pros. I think the only con you could say is like that 4-cylinder is unproven, but it's not like Toyota's not been able to make incredibly reliable turbo 4 cylinders before. I think people forget that like first gen 4Runners had 22 RTE. The T means turbo. 3S GTEs are bomb proof from like, MR2 turbos, Celica tracks, that kind of stuff from the 90s. So they can make a turbo 4-cylinder hold together. Now, will it maybe take a year or two for them to figure everything out? Sure. But I don't think we're going to have to be as worried about reliability as everybody else is. And it's just going to be exceptionally a better engine. And I think we also have to talk about, those V6s are so much more reliable. How many people are popping them because they've been ragging the daylights out of them because they got 35s on stock gears? You're not going to blow the new 4-cylinder up because you have 35s on stock gears because it can't make it up a hill and you're wrapping the rev limiter everywhere you go. So, gotta say, I think they're pretty good. Does the old Tickers got anything to say?
How'd you get into shocks? Seth says.
That's a good question. I'm poor, and I used to be in street cars. I used to be a real drift kid, and being poor. 1 horsepower makes your car faster. It also spins tires. You spend more money on tires. So the way I was always able to try to be able to tandem in the great LS swap transition with a 4-cylinder car was getting my car really hooked up with the suspension. So I kind of just started really liking shocks because you can really unlock a lot more out of the car while being as broke as I am. And like a lot of times that's kind of like the secret. And when it comes to off-road, that's like the secret of everything. That suspension might allow you to not only fit larger tires, but handle them, gives you more articulation, does everything. So like when you're on a really high-end off-road build, the suspension is the center of it. On the really high-end drift build, suspension setup is almost more important than the horsepower. A road course car suspension is the heart of it and the hardest thing to set up. Getting a motor to make horsepower and work just costs dollars. Getting suspension to work costs dollars and knowledge, and so it's a little more interesting for me because like there is the greater X factor of tuning. Whereas like I know if I have this duration camshaft and this lift camshaft and I put it with this intake manifold and I have the right valve size and I have fuel for it, it's going to make probably this power at this RPM. Now suspension can be calculated almost to that level, but there's so much of an X factor in it, and there's so much of an X factor to feel. It's easier to get your vehicle to feel the way you want it to feel through suspension. You can make a greater change to your driving enjoyment and feel the suspension than like an engine. It's kind of hard to do. If I want to make power, it's going to make power at this RPM and do this thing on this engine most of the time.
Well, the power is like based on like flat ground usually, right?
Yeah.
Where the suspension, like there's so many more dynamic. I don't know. Once you get out on the dirt, the on paper stuff may be different.
Exactly. Well, and like if you've ever been off road, like a 200 horsepower engine can outdrive most suspension systems. Like if you drove most modern cars out of the dealership, I guarantee you wouldn't be able to keep it wide open down a dirt road. Guarantee it. Without dying. You can do it. You just won't do it for long.
But it doesn't have the support.
The support or the suspension to do it. And I have yet to be able to build a car that has more suspension than horsepower off-road.
Right.
It's pretty hard to do. I mean, unless you got a Samurai. Well, they have no suspension. Maybe if you like long traveled your first gen 4-cylinder Tacoma, you might have more suspension than engine. Yeah. But it took a long time to get there. You didn't just and a motor swaps probably cost less than all the suspension it took to get there. That's for sure.
Well, yeah. And you can really use the suspension off road. Whereas oftentimes, like, what are you going to do with 1,000 horsepower? Go to jail.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And 500 horsepower in the dirt feels like 2,000 horsepower on the street. I'm going to tell you that right now. I used to talk about the math, like 500 horsepower in the rain is 750 horsepower in the dry. 500 horsepower in the dirt is 1,000 horsepower, whatever. Leon asked, you guys ever get any fancy Land Rovers or G-Wagons? Not really all that much. The Land Rovers, like all the newer ones, are all air suspension. There's not really much you can do with them. The G-Wagons, nobody wheels a G-Wagon, and really like one of the best bolt-on shocks you can get are like Fox 2.0s, which are have their limits. Or King, I think King has 2.5s, but like we've maybe sold one set in the last 8 years, or the last 6 years I've been here. So we don't really, and I just don't think those people are building those to do that. And I think so the G-Wagon probably has the most capacity, but the average G-Wagon you would see only has like the 8-inch, 200 millimeter ring gear diffs. They don't get the big stuff unless you get like a 4x4 squared. You don't get the portals. So like V8 horsepower running much bigger than the stock tires, you're asking to break a lot of stuff. So I don't know that a lot of people, make that leap.
Albert asks, do we recommend running the 8112 stock height or lifted configuration, asking if it affects bump stop?
Yeah, so there's almost not any, I can't really think of an 8112 that's will let you get to stock height. Bill Stein, because they're position sensitive, they will have probably the least amount of adjustment range of anything else because they want to keep you in the meat of that primary ride zone. So there's a few inches between the internal hydraulic bump stop on compression and rebound engage. Most of the time, the optimal setting for the 8112s is what they come out of the box at or close to it. Most of the time, they'll tell you, hey, if you have a Tundra with a 5.7 and a crew cab and it's 4-wheel drive, they'll be at 2.75 inches of lift, and that's like optimal. And that's usually the case with most coilovers. The only adjustments to get to the optimal, preload setting or ride height range on a stock weight vehicle is if like you have something that fits, but it's drastically different than what they were optimized for. So we'll use that Tundra as an example. If you had like a single cab V6 Tundra, you might want to back two-wheel drive. You might want to back off some preload. But a usual rule of thumb is get it to the height that they're supposed to hit out of the box that they say for the vehicle that they were optimized for, or at least get them into the middle of their adjustment range. Ricky M on Instagram asks, I bought the 2019 Ram 4x4 with the stock Fox 2.0 collab. They all blew out before 70,000 miles, and shops won't rebuild them. I don't know why shops won't rebuild them. What you're probably, you know what? It's probably a 1500. It's probably the Mopar lift, which they do a lot of weird stuff on the OE specific, like semi-aftermarket Mopar, TRD, lift kit stuff. A lot of times they'll use a pill for the nitrogen port, or they'll use like a little, literally a wax pill that they melt over, and it's like impossible to replace. And there's a very high likelihood with that. Eventually, when you go to charge them with nitrogen, they're not going to hold nitrogen. Honestly, a Fox 2.0 should be rebuilt every 50,000 miles or less. It's just a shame those are kind of hard to rebuild. I wouldn't use that as like, you can always rebuild the Fox 2.0s we carry. The direct stuff from Fox, usually pretty easy to rebuild, although sometimes it's not always worthwhile. Though that stuff is, the bean counters over at Mopar kind of, and every, major manufacturer end up screwing things up. The Roush stuff for the Fords like that. It's unfortunate, but that's kind of the way it goes. Leon on YouTube asked, what's some advantages and disadvantages of internal versus external bypass, IFP versus no IFP? So the benefit of an internal versus an external bypass is actually you can have more bypass ports and more zones, but the drawback is the piston size is going to be probably a half-inch smaller relative to a body size. So where a 2.5-inch body regular coilover shocker external bypass has like that 58 to 60 millimeter piston, a 2.5 internal bypass is going to have a 50 millimeter piston, the same size piston they use in the 2.0. So that's kind of the drawback. But because, like, as you can imagine, packaging bypass tubes externally is hard, and you can only have so many on the body before you run out of real estate. You can actually get more ride zones out of the sleeved internal bypass design. So, like, it's super cool. And the other benefit is, at least on the Fox design, they pin shims to it. So, like, shims, like the piston of the shock. So you get those deflective shims. So you can really fine tune the tuning there at each zone, which you can't do to the same level on an external bypass. But they're like, you would have to take the shock apart to change tuning on those zones. So on most of the shocks, there are, and OMI BP51s, technically you're adjusting that zone for the outside, but they're like the outlier. So it does make it harder to adjust those zones, but you have more control and you have more individual zones available. Now, IFP versus no IFP. So you're talking internal floating piston gas charge monotube versus the without an IFP, without internal floating piston, it's an emulsion stock. So the oil and the gas can mix together, they eventually emulsify. By separating the oil and gas, they can be much more consistent, less prone to cavitation, and like on an emulsion shock, the viscosity of the oil is very critical for the tuning. And as oil gets hotter, it gets thinner, and so it'll be much more affected by temperature. That's why almost nobody makes emulsion shocks anymore. It costs almost no extra money to have an IFP. It's not really any harder to assemble. You just nobody really does it because they just don't work well. Hey man, joined this late. Any chances you guys are doing something similar to the live series for the current F-150s? Yeah. So we have our own F-150. Basically, how these lives work is we go live the day before we release something on YouTube. Tomorrow we're doing a 60-second breakdown of the Radflos 500Rs for 6th generation 4Runners. So we're talking about 6th generation 4Runners today. To answer another question, actually, from Haas55 over on YouTube, without actually answering it, we will be doing more F-150 stuff soon. We received an early production part from iBach. I think we can guess what it is. We already have them in stock. They're going to be installed and start testing tomorrow. And so you'll see more about that. We'll talk about that, answer all your questions ahead of that release. The Wednesday before it comes out, it's usually we go live Wednesday, we drop the stuff Thursday. If something happens, it might come out Friday. M over on YouTube asked, what do you think Bronco Wild Track Fox 2.5 shocks do you need update? So I think if you're talking about, I think the 2.5s are fine. I think the only thing I would complain about them is the 2.5-inch body internal bypass is only a 2-inch piston. I think there's a lot left to be desired on the off-the-shelf tuning, but they're actually very good. I think ultimately, I would not buy those shocks after the fact. So I wouldn't buy somebody's takeoffs because it's a waste of time. But if I would spend the money for that Haas 3.0 package or whatever to get the better steering rack, and those shocks are definitely more comfortable than the Bilsteins. Still something you're going to upgrade eventually. Trust me, I know. But I think they're worth it for the comfort over the Bilsteins and the reservoirs not falling off. And really for that steering rack. So, yeah. Let me see here. All right. And yeah, so we are going to, so if you guys want to make sure you catch all the new stuff we're doing, probably keep an eye on our stories tomorrow. A lot of you guys have been asking about a certain iBot product. We have it before everybody else. I'm not going to come out and say it, but the math is math. And if you're over on YouTube, you've already seen the question asking about them. But they're bigger than a 2.0 and they're coilovers and shocks for the F-150. Leon asked, do you think it'd be worthwhile if Bilstein made a 6112 version that's valve more for comfort, progressive, or linear? I think they could, and I think they would sell it. I think the real problem is the 6112s are unequivocally more comfortable than stock stuff on the vast majority of the applications they're made for. Bilstein's also probably not going to spend the money to use linear pistons and sell two. I think they could sell some. I don't think it's going to be worthwhile for Bilstein to do. And currently, there's a lot more of those 2.5-inch IFP options that are softer and are similar in price. You're never going to beat a Bilstein price. Bilstein's always going to be the best price. But there are starting to be a lot more really solid options that are a lot more linear. One of those options are like the Icon 2.5 VXPs. They're digressive on rebound, but linear on compression. Certainly a lot softer, more comfortable, about as soft as I would ever want something, and still very supportive and stable. NT64s, I wouldn't necessarily say they're softer, but they're a good suitable option. Fox is now offering 2.5 performance series without reservoirs. In the case of the Broncos, you can get them without springs. We use your stock springs like the 6100s. They have the secondary top out piston. They're sweet. Radflos has their 600Rs, which if they're anything like the 500Rs and just have that little bit of extra support, chef's kiss. And now that brand that starts with an E and ends with an H and rhymes with Ryback has 2.5s coming out very soon. I think that'll be another suitable alternative. So I think it's worthwhile for those to exist. I don't know that Bilstein will do it. One, because they already make enough money on the 6112s, they can barely keep up with inventory as is. And two, there are a lot of suitable options that kind of fill that space for not too much more money. Adrian AS90 on Instagram asked, do you guys have pen-to-pen suited for Y61 Nissan, an eyelet, the eyelet for the rear that goes for 6 inches of lift? I believe we have King options that can be built, Radflos options that can be built. I think even Dobinsons might have some, but you don't quote me on the Dobinsons. But I know there are Radflos and Kings available. King has 2.5s. I believe if Radflos doesn't have 2.0s, and if you guys are watching, feel free to slide in here. But if they don't have a cheaper 2.0 option, I'm sure it's something they could build. So yeah, we do have options available. Reach out to the team directly on shocksurplus.com with your vehicle information, your use cases, your goals, and we can steer you in the right direction. But probably a King or Radflow, and after testing some of these Radflows, definitely look, they're very good. They got a good idea how to tune stuff. Apparently, they got it real figured out. Ticker's got something.
Jay says Bilstein 8112s are King 2.5s for 3rd gen Tacoma. I haven't heard back on his use style, but
I don't need to hear back on the use style. There's almost no situation where I would recommend the Kings over the Bilsteins. It's not to say the Kings aren't great. We've tested them. They're amazing. And the Bilsteins aren't even out. I don't even have to test the Bilsteins to know that they're going to do everything better than the Kings. They'll be available with dual speed compression adjusters with that JCO adjuster. They're position sensitive. They're going to last multiple times as long. They're going to basically be able to be more comfortable, more supportive, and basically more comfortable than the Kings and allow you to do things that the rest of the truck might not be able to keep up with. So yeah, the 8112s are going to be the better shocks. You'll probably be waiting till the end of the year until they're available. But if you keep it locked on our socials, we're keeping locked in with the Bilstein releases, and we're in talks with them to make sure that like when the stuff drops, we're getting, some of the first inventory you can get. Leon asks, what is the best lift and why is it the 6-inch rough country? Nothing from rough country is the best lift, and the best lift depends on how you're doing it. So if you're talking about lift height specifically, lift height is determined. The ideal lift height is really determined by use case for ideal performance. On an independent suspension vehicle, I will almost never recommend anything that gets you high enough to need a drop bracket because that's like the worst thing you can do. So a lot of times 3.5 is the most. Some applications you might be able to get away with 4. It just very much depends. But no drop brackets, none of that. And it just kind of depends on how you're using it. So like your goal with a lift kit is to maximize suspension travel as much as possible, at least in our eyes first. And on most vehicles, there is a point of diminishing returns where although you're going taller, you're not gaining that much more usable travel. And you really want to be as low as possible, as tall as you have to be. Because the taller you lift it, the worse it's going to handle, the more things you're going to have to change, the more corrections you're going to have to make. And even after you correct all that geometry, there's nothing you can do about the physics of your center of gravity being taller. So determining the ultimate lift height really, it comes down to a lot of use case and application. For solid axle vehicles, there oftentimes is more reason to go taller because there is less of that bell curve where the bell curve is less extreme, where like, let's say you got a Toyota, the coilovers, let's say, extended travel coilovers will get you up to 3 inches of lift. Any taller lift height coilover with a drop bracket kit's not going to have any more travel. So if let's say you get 10 inches of travel with a 0 to 3 inch lift coilover, going to 4 to 6 isn't really going to help you, and losing the clearance from the drop bracket isn't going to help you. But on a solid axle vehicle like a Jeep, you can kind of go taller and just kind of to a degree run longer shocks. A lot of times the, point in which it starts to go downhill is around the 4 to 5.5, 4 to 6 inch lift mark. A lot of times after 6 inches, you're just not really gaining anything. And then where you kind of land also is determined by shock choice. And again, use case, the lower you're sitting in your travel, the more it's going to articulate. So let's say if you have a coilover that does 1 to 3 inches of lift, being at the lower side, the 1 to 2 inch means you're going to have more articulation, might be better in the rocks. But if you're going fast off-road, you want more bump travel. So you might want to be at that 2 to 3 inch lift mark. And then, the right option for you in terms of shock choice, spring choice, all the parts you need, depends on your budget, use case, and the vehicle. Let me see here. Ticker's got anything?
Nothing new yet.
All right. Well, yeah. And so, let's talk about some reasons why we stay away from rough country. they have gotten so much better about their quality. If they send you the right parts, they're probably going to fit, which wasn't always the case. I think the real issue is don't have a good handle on the plot in terms of what actually matters for performance. They're about getting you the lift. And I think I've talked to the company who makes their shocks for them, and I mean, don't quote me on this. I've talked to a company that makes their shocks for them, and they're not in the same country where most of the vehicles we own are made, which means a lot. It just seems like their tuning isn't there. And then on their higher end shocks, like you're not getting seals. Nobody's rebuilding them. Good luck. And so, and even if I'm wrong and they have an in-house tuning department, you can't beat billion-dollar brands, $1 million, billion-dollar brands who have literal like 30 doctors of engineering working on the suspension. Basically, it's just kind of like a different thing. But like, if it gets you into the lift and all you got to do is change the shocks later, it's all about the right deal. You know what I mean?
Yeah, if that's all you're worried about.
Yeah.
Is the look.
Yeah.
You could at least start with that and
get a good set of shocks when you're tired of losing your teeth.
Right.
Leon asked on YouTube, is it generally a myth that a lift to clear larger tires, it follows the same path on the up travel? Yeah. So we always say the lift in and of itself is not actually clearing the larger tires. It's limiting up travel. So if, let's say, you went to go put on a 35-inch tire on your truck, and you cycled the suspension, and if at full, the tire is hitting things 2 inches before the suspension the shock would fully be compressed. So you have 2 inches of bump travel left on the table. A 2-inch lift with a 2-inch bump stop extension will ensure the tire will fit. For the most part, as you add lift, the tire path after alignment with geometry corrections might change slightly, but we're not talking about large amounts and will largely be in the same spot. Except for extreme examples like Toyotas, once you add a lift and then you run like a lot of caster to push the front tires forward, particularly uppers and lowers, the axle path, the tire path is now different because it's starting from further forward and landing. It's starting and ending further forward. But for the most part, when you're looking just at the vertical plane, up and down as you lift, it's going to be the same, And so the only way to truly clear larger tires is cut what hits, which is what I like to do, or don't and see what hits and then hope it self-clearance is what I really do. And then limit bump travel accordingly. And so our goal with a suspension setup that's designed, that you're buying to clear larger tires, is to ensure that at the very absolute least, that after we've had to limit the travel as much as we've had to, that you've gained enough with that suspension lift to begin with, that even with a bump stop extension, even with limiting the travel, you still have at least the same amount of upward travel as stock. And in a perfect world, you would have more and more droop travel. And so that's another way where that can ultimately determine lift height. Let's say I always use JKs because I remember like the travel numbers for some reason. A JK has like 8 inches of travel. JK Jeep, so what is that? 07 to 18 has like 8 inches of travel, 4 up, 4 down. There are a lot of shocks that have like 10 or 11 inches of travel that are just 2 inches longer than stock fully compressed. So essentially, you could do a 2-inch lift with a 2-inch bump stop spacer, have the same amount of bump travel in stock, more down travel in stock, fit those tires that required that 2-inch bump stop spacer, and be met. Now, where it gets better is, let's say, now let's pump that up to 4 inches of lift. Now you have 2 inches more bump travel in stock, at least the same amount of droop or even more, and you got those bigger tires. So it's win, 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 win. But that is usually more the case on solid axle vehicles because you can see much greater gains in overall suspension travel with your lift kit. With IFS, that's why we're kind of more modern stuff like Brother Be a Man and Cut It, because travel gains are much smaller. If let's say I can gain 5 inches of travel, with just a lift kit on my Jeep, I might only gain 2 on my Tacoma, so.
Mob Eduardo says, just got a 25 F-150 5.0. What do we recommend to level it? Was looking at the iBox Pro.
iBox are great. The iBox Stage 2 kit, I wouldn't look at Stage 1, wouldn't look at the Pro Truck Sports. You'll be calling us within a year or two to get better stuff. It's not that they're bad, but it can be better, and people have a lot of complaints, and it's like worth the money. So Stage 2 is great. The only things that would take me out of it is, one, do you actually really like to go off-road a lot for fun? That's not going to be enough shock. Check out the Bilstein 6112s, 5100s, or 5160s. Two, are you carrying a lot of load? If you're doing a lot of towing and hauling, the iBox are better than stock, but that's another case where the Bilsteins might be the better choice. But great options. Reach out to the team directly for a more specific recommendation, and let us just know budget goals, use cases, all that stuff, and we can probably get you a little better dialed in. Miguel over on Instagram was asking, what calculation or method do you use to determine the correct replacement for the coil springs? Sometimes it's vibes, dog. But most of the time it's pretty easy to calculate. Springs are measured by pounds per inch. So if a spring is 600 pounds per inch, 600 pounds is going to make it compress an inch. And so I'm factoring in to basically get a base spring rate number. I'm looking at approximate corner weight or changes in weight in motion ratio. So like Toyota has like a 2-to-1 motion ratio. And so it has a 600 pound per inch spring on each side. If you added 200 pounds of bumper, you would just add 100 pounds per inch of spring rate, and you'd be able to achieve the same ride height. So it's pretty direct math, but there is some kind of I say vibes just because there is a little bit more nuance to it based on feel. So if, let's say, I'm looking at something very soft valved and linear, or like something more linear, I might be more in valving in terms of the shock. I might be more willing, or might go up in spring rate more than I would on something with digressive valving. If it doesn't have sway bars and like maybe it's not a solid axle vehicle with a radius arm that isn't going to sway much at all anyway, I might go up a little bit more in spring rate. If it's a rock crawler, I would want to be as low in spring rate as possible. If I know the guy is like never going to be out of the skinny pedal off-road, might be on a little bit more spring rate. So that's what I mean when I say some of it's vibes, dog. Spring rate's otherwise pretty easily calculated, motion ratio relative to how much weight you're adding or subtracting. Softer shock for Chevy 2500 depends on the year. Fox is usually on the softer side. Skyjacker M95s are available, but for specific recommendations, reach out to the team directly, and they'll be able to get you dialed in. I'm sure we have an option that's going to be great for you. What's TikTok got? Nothing?
Should I save for Kings or just do Fox? Clarification was just wide open jumper.
So
Flyboy.
So he likes to jump it. Should I save for Kings or run the Fox? So Fox very likely, it depends on the application. Fox probably has a comparable shock to the King. It's probably the same or more money. So what you're asking is, it depends on the level of the shock. If you like to go fast, I would not run anything less than a 2.5-inch body with a reservoir. If you like to jump it, anything less than a 2.5-inch body with the reservoir isn't going to do the trick. You're going to be wasting your money. So if it's Fox 2.0 versus the King 2.5, don't waste your money on the Fox. If it's a Fox 2.5 that you're getting a good deal on versus a King 2.5, get the Fox. And even if you're unhappy with the valving, all those shocks are tunable. So we can revalve them to your specs. But, nothing less than a 2.5-inch body with a reservoir, or it's just money you're going to throw away. And it probably won't be a shock you'll be able to resell used, because I can guarantee you're going to blow it up. Leon asked what percentage of ride quality is suspension versus wheel and tires. That's a good question. Because it can be I think that percentage can vary, based on how bad the setup is. So like, it's kind of hard to describe. So, a too stiff of a sidewall tire, too heavy of a tire for the amount of like the level of suspension you have. So too much unsprung mass and too stiff of a sidewall will absolutely kill the ride. If we're going to go from 100% of what it could be, it will make the ride as much as 40% worse. But with the right wheel and tire, it can at best probably only make it 30% better than the best it could ever be, if that makes sense. So the areas where wheel and tire will make a big difference for ride quality is one, bigger tires, particularly with more sidewall, but just the bigger makes bumps smaller. There's less rollover resistance. So like, if the bump is this big and your tire is the same size, no good. But if the bump is this big, if the bump's the same size and your tire is twice the size, it's no big deal. A boulder turned into a pebble. Same thing in the opposite direction. Where it becomes a problem is too much tire and not enough shock and not enough spring rate will make for a horrible ride because it will be completely unable to manage that unsprung mass. All that weight of that tire is going to try to go up, come off the ground, hit the ground again, and it's just going to dribble, and it's going to be all over the place. It's going to drive terrible, ride awful. And too stiff of a sidewall will mean, although over really big suspension events, the shocks are still working, it's not going to isolate anything square-edged or smaller. So too stiff a sidewall will ruin your small bump compliance. So we ask what wheels and tires you're running, particularly size more than anything. But when we're setting you up with shock options, because like, let's say a Fox 2.0 might be like the most comfortable thing for your vehicle, but you got 40-inch tires, it's going to ride like garbage. Let's say Bilstein 6112s would normally be crazy comfortable, way more comfortable than stock on the right load rating tire, on like a C load tire. But you put an E or an F on it, that on a vehicle that doesn't need an E or an F, those 6112s are going to be horrible. So I would say safely, 70% suspension, 30% wheels and tires, but the wrong setup could make it more like 60-40. So it has, you can really ruin things with wheels and tires. And even a great riding setup. But, if you stay within the realm of normalcy, you're fine. Like, you have a 33-inch tire and it's a C load and you have a C load vehicle, you have it's the right weight for it. Most shocks are going to be able to handle it. And even if like that is known for having the worst, stiffest sidewall of any C load tire, I can almost guarantee it's not going to be horrible. With the right set of shocks, but
Barbie asks, can we revalve Gen 1 Raptor shocks?
Yeah, we can. Yeah, we can get them tuned. We can, do whatever you want with them. I'm going to be honest with you. It depends on what your goals are. A lot of the times, optimizing the 2-inch piston in the front just becomes very hard. So we can valve them, but you're going to be making compromises somewhere. So like, I want it to not bottom out. It's going to ride like shit over small bumps. You want it to ride better over smaller bumps. It might get out of control really easily. They're fairly well optimized out of the box. So any direction you try to gain will come at the expense of something else in a lot of cases, which is why all the aftermarket stuff is a 3.0, because it gives you that little bit of extra.
Yeah, when you start with.
Yeah. Lamp Bryson, would a 1/2-inch to 1-inch tread spacer be okay on top of my iBox stage 1s? 1 inch might be pushing it, but if you have an aftermarket upper control arm, you might be able to get a 1/2-inch on most vehicles. I would just make sure after you've done that, you test for CV bind, which is basically what you do. You put the front end on jack stands, let it extend all the way, steer it all the way from left and right in 4-wheel drive, so they're spinning. And if one or both of the tires stop while you're steering, you got CV bind, you need a diff drop. So let me see. I'm Radflos. Heavier big wheels affect ride quality. Yeah. So increased wheel and tire size comes with more unsprung mass. Unsprung mass is basically the weight of your vehicle that is not being held up by the suspension, and is exponentially more difficult for your shocks and springs to manage than sprung mass. The way I've heard it explained 1,000 times, and probably my teacher at the fab school basically explained it as, your suspension has to deal with the mass of that wheel and tire and all the other unsprung mass coming up over a bump. It has to slow it down and then speed it back up back to the ground. And a lot of times that requires a stiffer spring, but that's going to make ride harsh everywhere else. So the work around that is you want a better set of shocks, a larger diameter body, and so like I usually say, up to a 34-inch tire. 2-inch body stuff is probably fine for most people. Go to a 2.5 for a 35-inch or larger. And there's some 2.0s on some applications where like a 35 is probably okay. But general rule of thumb on most vehicles, 2.0s up to a 34, maybe a 35. For 35s and larger, don't run anything less than a 2.5. Almost doesn't matter what kind of vehicle you have. Let's see here.
When you think about, I like when you word it that way, because when you think about the work that's being done from like kind of a physics standpoint, the way that the suspension works, almost regardless of which one it is, but just like that is kind of an impressive feat that it is sort of taking that much weight, redirecting it back down, changing the speeds on it, and then doing it over and over and over and over again, like every second.
Yeah, exactly. And Leon asked again, you ever just, bro, what are you doing when someone gets expensive suspension but is riding on dubs? Yeah. Reservoirs look cool, so they spend the money for the reservoirs. And that's another point of proving form follows function. The coolest looking rigs are the ones that look like they can perform well. And so when you see these like rolling on 24s, it's like this mismatch of like, this person obviously knows that form follows function, but not enough to know that like those paper thin tires mean it's never going to go off road. And like, it's just weird to me that you're going to build like a $65,000 show truck that doesn't really go fast, turn, do anything to please other dudes. And the cool dudes who know about suspension and know about performance know well enough to know that like that shit's lame. So yeah, bro, what are you doing?
Fashion is a hell of a drug.
Yeah. So Lyle Taplin, why did I rub really bad on KO3s on an Icon 2.5 3-inch lift? Did trim, but I rubbed on the cab mount. You're not running enough positive caster. Run more positive caster. Push the front tires forward, and you won't need to do a cab mount chop. You might need to do a Viper cut. But offset of your wheels will also supercharged GM. You're right. Offset of the wheels will be a big factor of that. If you run too low of an offset, too wide of a wheel. So I wouldn't really run much wider than an 8.5 inch wide, much lower than a 0 offset. It's kind of it, because I assume it's a Tacoma because you're talking about cab mount, or a Toyota 4Runner, Tacoma FJ, all the same thing. If you're running too low of an offset, you'll have a greater scrub radius. So the path the tires take, the arc they take is now greater. It's now wider, and you'll be deeper into the cab mount, deeper into the front bumper. But if your offset is, conservative, no lower than 0, no wider than a wheel, no wider than 8.5, if you run enough positive caster, you shouldn't have any issues. And if you can't run enough positive caster, check out Super Pro double adjustable lower control arms. They'll be able to push the front tires forward a whole lot. Yeah, so your offset's not crazy. It's 0. You just need to run more caster. It's just the way it goes. On Toyotas, a lot of times anything less than 5 degrees is going to rub with a 33. Thoughts on spring swap on OEM struts over a Bilstein 5100 setup? The problem with most OEM struts is, so your OEM suspension is designed for the height it's at, and they're designed to work with the amount of travel that they have. When you run a spring on it, since you're not gaining any travel, you're extending the strut further, so it's going to top out more often. Additionally, means there's going to be a lot of captured spring force, and most factory suspension setups are wholly underdamped on rebound as is, so it's just going to top out constantly, ride like garbage. It's would be better than a lot of preload lifts because a lot of times they'll use a softer spring to achieve that lift, but it's not the way to do it. 5100s are not only tuned with stiffer rebound so that like the captured spring force isn't going to make it ride harsh and top out all the time. A lot of times they're longer in travel, at least by a little bit, so that when you lift it, you have close to the same amount of droop travel as stock. So yeah, don't. The only things that like you might get away with throwing a small spring lift on are things that have a lot of travel to begin with, like Raptors and other things like that. But it introduces a lot of failures to the top hat. So there's like better solutions like the SDI top hats and stuff like that that work with like a little bit of preload on the spring, but also are like a spacer. So like you're staying in the right zone of the shocks, you're not overextending them, you're not dealing with too much spring force going through the top hat, and you're gaining that, and it's not enough external spacer to cause binder issues like that. So I would go unless I had something with really good suspension from the factory. Unless they said Fox, unless they, unless they are Fox internal bypass shocks, which is probably the best thing you can get from the factory for most brands, or like the Bilstein Blackhawk E2s on the TRX, I would get 5100s over almost any spring lift because I can guarantee you stock stuff rides like garbage, and it's just going to ride like garbage with a spring lift.
What does that look like under damped on rebound?
So when something isn't damped well enough on rebound, particularly if it's limited on down travel, it's just going to top out. If you've seen our review of the iBox Stage 2 kit on Jeff's Tundra, it didn't have enough travel for the amount of lift that they let you set them to. And although could have been okay, despite being a little low on droop travel, they were too soft on rebound. So you'd hit a bump and it would just fully extend the suspension and top out and be harsh. Just thump, clunk hard. And it just doesn't feel good. And additionally, on larger suspension events, even if you're not topping out, if they're underdamped on rebound, that's when you get that out of control bounce. That like floaty, everything's out of control, it's pogo sticking. A lot of that comes from rebound. Just ordered the 6112s and 6100s for my 25 Tundra. Do you all just a ride height or just send them stock? So if you ordered from, there's two options available from us for the 61, three options. You either ordered them unassembled, which is the cheapest option. You got to build them yourself. You order them assembled, where we assemble them at your desired lift height, so anywhere from stock to 2.3 inches of lift, or you order them from our 2.3 inch lift spec standard lift system, which will do 2.3 inches of lift. So look at your order confirmation. It'll tell you what you ordered. If you have questions, you can reach out to the team directly. But it will only be assembled if a part of a complete lift system, or you order from a listing that specifically said they are assembled, at which point you would choose your circlip setting. FSeb on YouTube asked thoughts on the new Ironman 2.5 monotubes. Honestly, pricing looks good. Quality looks really good. I haven't always loved the way Ironman tunes their stuff on a lot of applications, but we've also only really spent a lot of time on their foam cell pro kits, which are pretty awful. So I have pretty high hopes for those being really good because they're finally using a half decent shock design. And it's all just a matter of tuning. They're user serviceable and rebuildable, which means they also should be able to be valve. You can custom valve them. So even if like there are some, they're not tuned the best, at least you have a lot more recourse. So I think they're a good option. We're definitely going to test a set just before we put our stamp of approval on them. But they look really good at the price point. I'm just, there are a lot of other things at that level from brands who we have a little bit more faith in the tuning. But I think they have the capacity to be very good. And even if they're not as well optimized out of the box, you can probably optimize them a little better yourself.
We got a Tacoma owner driving, daily driving, and when he gets a chance, going hard off-road, looking to decide between Fox Performance Elites with DSC or King Adjustable Tacoma.
And that's going to kind of come down to your preferences, and really, the real selling factor there is going to be load or handling. If you have load to deal with, having the low speed specific adjuster, independent of the high speed adjuster of the Fox, going to be nice. If you're a real stickler for handling, although the Foxes are going to be stiffer riding than the Kings in most situations, if you really don't like having body roll, you will ultimately be able to get a softer ride out of the Fox with the dual speed compression adjusters while achieving your handling goals than the Kings. So the Kings have the one-way adjuster. It's pretty much adjusting high speed and low speed compression at the same time. So low speed compression is your body roll, your brake dive, your handling. High speed compression is most of your bump stiffness. On a King, if let's say it rides too stiff, you might have to sacrifice a little bit more body roll to get that softer ride, and vice versa, which is why I say if you are a real handling stickler, you want that thing to be as locked down as it can be for a lifted, truck or SUV. The Fox might actually, although stiffer riding, in the base valving, if you ran them both at full soft, the Fox would be a lot stiffer. You might be able to achieve a better handling balance, or a handling balance you'd be happier with. While still having a softer ride, because you can tune low speed and high speed independently. I would also highly just recommend checking out the 8112s. They have the DSA Plus adjusters available. They're a little bit more money, but you would save a lot of money on service over the life. They last, 2 to 3 times as long between rebuilds. And if you get the bypass, at least in the rear end, definitely the DSA Plus in the front, there is not a situation where the Bilsteins aren't more comfortable or supportive of everything like that. I haven't checked, but do you guys have a video on various brands going against each other? Yeah, we do. We have tons of videos over on YouTube. Check out our YouTube channel. We do head-to-head shootouts all the time on specific applications, buyer's guides, all of that. Usually how things go is we test, all the things that we think are pertinent to test on a particular application individually first, and then we run it back and start comparing them so people have, the insight. So yeah, we got a lot of comparisons. We got a lot more comparisons coming soon as well. And I think that's, the most important thing about testing something on your own vehicle is like, yeah, I can tell you these are good, but I can also tell you these might be bad, these might be better, and these might be pretty good as well. So yeah, we definitely do. And I think that's really important for us to do. And moving forward, we're going to be making sure to do that kind of in sections. Most recently, we did a head-to-head on Icon 2.5 EXPs versus Bilstein 6112s, because they ended up being our two favorite circlip adjustable 2.5, 2.6-inch body, non-reservoir struts, coilovers, and all of that. And we've been able to test them both on my old Bronco when I had it, as well as Jeff's Tundra. And so that's kind of the theme. And then once we've gone through everything on a vehicle, we do our buyer's guides where we compare everything at least briefly. So all that's up on Shock Surplus over on YouTube. Check that out. We got you covered. What's comparable to Ironman 2.5 for comfort at 2 inches of lift with a 4Runner? I can't really tell you how they land on comfort because I haven't tested them yet. I can tell you options that will probably cost similar money and I would have more faith in, or like the old Emu MT624s, Bilstein 6112s, and eventually the 6100s will start to be available for 4Runners, a lot of other stuff. So reach out to the team directly. Let us know what your goals are, your budget, and what you're actually using the vehicle for, and the team will be able to tell you what the right shock is rather than saying, what's kind of like these? We'll just tell you what you need. Leon asked, thoughts on new Tundras and Tacomas having rear coil springs versus Leafs. I think it's the best thing that they ever did. I'm a strong believer in leaf springs on a truck to do truck things if the company is good at making leaf springs. So we're talking Ford, Chevy. That's it. Toyota, in the history of their company, has never once made a good leaf spring. And they continually got worse every time they tried. So coil springs are definitely the way to go. I do think you might make some compromises in like towing and hauling, but you can make up for that with like airbags and other load leveling aids like sumo springs. And it ultimately is made for a lot better ride. And with the right shocks, more usable articulation. They put down power better. They do everything better. Yes, a leaf spring could potentially be better under like, a variable load condition if built right, but Toyota doesn't know how to do that. So
we got a guy asking about Metal Cloak Bronco. We need you to test the new Metal Cloak Bronco shocks. Have you heard? We haven't.
I've heard of them. Maybe we'll test them eventually. I think it's really interesting what they're doing with valving. I don't know why they spent the money on that design rather than something more position sensitive, but I really like what Metal Cloak does. So definitely worth a test. I can't guarantee when that's going to happen. I haven't heard back from you guys in the email yet. If I have a TRD lift on a 3rd gen Tundra, do I need to downgrade the longer CV axles if placing a 6112? No, you don't. Stock CVs are fine. The Ready Lift, the TRD silvers, all of the axle shafts are fine with the 6112s, both base model blacks up to silvers, up to all the aftermarket stuff. You're fine. I hate the body roll on my 07 Sequoia. Can I fit 5160 rear from a 06 Tundra on the rear of my 07 Sequoia? Nope and nope. The Tundra rear shocks are going to be too long for your Sequoia. And we're back. All right. It did some weird things. So 5160s from a 1st generation Tundra will not fit on your Sequoia. I believe 07 is 1st gen. I'm pretty sure it is. There isn't a 5160 that's going to work at stock height. If you can live with a 2-inch lift in the rear, you can use 100 series Land Cruiser. So same year Land Cruiser 5160 rear shocks. But there's not going to be pretty much any reservoir option that you're going to be able to run at stock height on that. And yeah, you can run the 5100s. Otherwise, you want to keep it at stock height. But if the reservoir is important for you, you probably wouldn't want to keep it at stock height. The reservoir is for cooling, and if you're wheeling it hard enough to need the cooling of a reservoir in the back, stock height is going to be more of a limitation. What's a solid spring in the back? We like Icon RXTs are good. There's a lot of great options. Reach out to the team directly. We can dial you in on what's going to be the best for your vehicle. So we're done on Instagram. Sorry, YouTube, you're out of questions. TikTok, do we got anything? We're going to call it.
Looks like we're wrapped up here too. So
all right, guys. Well, tomorrow our Shocks and 60 on the Radflos 500 Hearts is dropping at 4 p.m. Pacific time. Check that out. And then we'll be doing more stuff in the coming weeks. Next Wednesday, we'll be live at the same time. So make sure to check that out, and we will be answering your questions. In the meantime, later, y'all. In the end.